All righty, folks. It is March of 2024. And there's a couple of big mysteries of the universe to which we have never had the answer. For instance, what lies beyond the cosmic radiation background, beyond the visible edge of the universe? Or what are they hiding under the Denver International Airport? Or more recently, where is Her Majesty Kate Middleton? No one has seen her in months. And possibly the biggest mystery of them all has been, where is the FAR CUI rule? It has been conspicuously missing since 2016. And today, on a Summit Up podcast exclusive, thanks to our weird rulemaking obsession, we've got a bit of a scoop for everybody. Because after 582 days since showing any signs of life, the FAR CUI rule has a heartbeat again. And we're going to talk about what that means and why a lot of people are going to hear this news and probably start to panic and freak out.
100,000 feet. What exactly is the FAR CUI rule, Jacob?
Okay, so let's go back to X's and O's here of the CUI program to the long lost time of 2016. So if you go far enough back in time, you have the executive order that Obama signed that starts the federal CUI program. It directs NARA to be the executive agent in charge of establishing the federal CUI program. And if you go all the way back to that time period, there was a 3-part plan, a very clear, you can find old slides, we'll have a picture on the screen, a very clear 3-part plan to establish and implement the CUI program. Some of these will sound familiar to people. You had the first part of the plan, the federal CUI rule, which we now know as 32 CFR Part 2002. This is the regulation that governs the entire federal CUI program. It directs the agencies to all stand up their individual CUI programs within their agencies. This is the part that says that CUI is categorized at the moderate impact for confidentiality. This is the part that talks about the minimum protections for it, how you can, how it's going to be categorized. It outlines everything involving the federal CUI program. That's the first part of the plan.
And then double checking when you say agencies. So the DoD is an agency, right? It's its
Correct.
own agency. So this is for all agencies, Jacob?
Every executive branch agency, basically across the federal government, every agency has to have a CUI program, because before the executive order, they all had sensitive unclassified information, but it was being handled differently. It wasn't being protected at all in many cases. It was being marked in like 2,200 different ways. There was a mishmash of authorities on the books. It was a huge mess. We couldn't share the data. We couldn't protect the data. Nobody was governing the data. And so there was this massive executive order overhauling how sensitive but unclassified information would be governed. The second part of the plan was NIST SP 800-171, because what happens when this data leaves the federal government environment and ends up in a non-federal environment? It doesn't just magically remove the sensitivity of the data. It doesn't just magically remove the minimum protections required for protecting the confidentiality of that data. But you can't just apply the federal RMF ATO system coming out of 853 controls to non-federal environments. There has to be, a little bit of tailoring done. As we've talked about many times before, they tailored a little bit too much, or way too much. Different topic. But there has to be a minimum standard for protecting the data in a federal environment and a minimum standard for protecting the data in a non-federal environment, which is why 800-171 is not a set of just DoD requirements. It's a federal-wide standard. It's why DoD didn't come up with it by itself. It's why NIST came up with the standards for protecting this data, which is referenced in the 32 CFR federal CUI program. Now, okay, so we've got a regulation governing what's going on in the agencies. We've got a minimum standard for what's going on when it's in a federal environment. We've got a minimum standard for what's going on when it's a non-federal environment. But what we're missing is a contract clause to apply those.
To ask. So where's that DFAR 7012, right?
Well,
because that's what originates it, right?
Well, sort of. So the third part of the plan was to have a universal contract clause to apply these requirements when contractors start dealing with the data. Sure. You've got the federal CUI program, the minimum standards, and then a FAR clause for when this applies in a non-federal environment that contractors have. But we never got the FAR CUI clause. We never got the contract clause for all of the federal agencies to apply to all federal contractors.
Never mind.
Question?
Never mind, because I think I know where this is going and I don't want to spoil it. Go.
Right. So in the meantime, the DoD was just hemorrhaging data from the defense industrial base, hand over fist, completely unchecked. Right. And so what were they supposed to do? What they did was, in the interim, they created their own DFARS clause, which we now know as DFARS 7012, to stand in for the guidance of the overall FAR clause, to apply the minimum requirements for CUI contained in 800-171 in accordance with the governance requirements of the federal CUI program in 32 CFR 2002. And at that time, circa 2015, 2016, all the way even up through 2018, you could not go to a government event. You could not go to a NIST event. You couldn't go to a DoD event. You couldn't go to a defense industry event where they were talking about this. You couldn't see the canned slides that everybody was using without them talking about the overall plan and without them referencing the fact that DFAR 7012 is a stand-in for the overall FAR CUI rule.
Yep.
Now, you fast forward through time and there's a bunch of problems, right? Because 800-171 has some gaps in it. DFAR 7012 doesn't have a verification mechanism in it. That gives rise to a bunch of bad stuff happening, which eventually acts as the catalyst for creating the CMMC program. Boom, everybody now starts paying attention to the requirements as a CMMC thing and CMMC as a DoD thing. And now people have conflated what was a long-standing, massive federal-wide program with being something DoD specific. And people outside of the defense space look at this as an anomaly, right? They look at this as like a weird experiment that the DoD is doing. And that's not true. As we have talked about on the podcast before, and as I have ranted on street corners around the country for the last several years, the DoD is a canary in the coal mine, right? This is coming for everyone because we're missing the FAR CUI rule. But the FAR CUI rule has been missing for so long that a lot of people, even in the CMMC ecosystem, don't even know that it's supposed to be a thing. And it's not hard to blame them, or it's hard to blame them for that because NARA hasn't been talking about it. DoD hasn't been talking about it. There's been basically no reference to the FAR CUI rule unless you tuned into one specific part of our podcast every few months, because there just haven't been any updates. But we got an update today, and so that's what we're going to talk about. If you're curious about more of how these things have played out over the timeline, we will link to the history of CMMC video that I did back in 2021, where it connects all of these dots of these overlapping pieces and talks specifically about the role of the famously missing FAR CUI rule. Okay, so that's the high level of what's going on.
So apologize for my co-host's super duper excitement, but this is something that he has been anticipating for a very long time and talking about. And I don't think that you can Conor McGregor people and say, I apologize to absolutely no one.
I don't know how the best way I could explain the FAR CUI rule and its significance. I've been thinking about how to summarize it. I would summarize it as it's a really, really, really big freaking deal, right?
Right.
It's a huge freaking deal and everyone should be paying attention. So
it was DFARS before DFARS was cool, right? Like it was the reason. Basically, they took long enough. The Defense Department was like, hey, we need something in place. Yeah. So we're supplementing from what you don't have in place. But they did have something in place, and it's something that we see in the semblances of the CMMC program, right? There is a clause.
Well, so what's going on here now, and we're going to talk about this as we get through, is what was supposed to happen was the FAR clause was supposed to lead the DFARS clause. It was supposed to lead all of the agency supplements to the FAR, but that didn't happen. And now DoD has been leading the show for so long. What will the FAR CUI rule look like? But before we get into the speculation, let's just talk about the specifics of what has happened recently and why we're talking about this.
It's crazy. We're like, it's just, what do you want to talk about first? What do you want to talk about first? Yeah, it's a squirrel. Like, let's do it.
It's pretty insane. Okay. So after almost 2 years, the FAR CUI rule has resolved the open findings from its regulatory review and has now gone up to the Office of Federal Procurement Policy, OFPP. This is an office within OMB, and it's another acronym, right? Within the heart of the regulatory review part of rulemaking. They're one of the pieces of that equation. So with FAR rules, OFPP review is the step before going to what people would be more familiar with, what we generally call regulatory review with OIRA, the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. When, if you recall a couple months ago, when we're waiting on the CMMC rule to come out, one of the big signals is it's gone from DoD to OIRA. It's gone from OIRA to the Federal Register, right? So before the FAR CUI rule goes to OIRA, it goes to OFPP. So this is why, if you look on the OMB dashboard, in case you wake up in the morning and F5 the OMB dashboard for whatever reason, you won't see the FAR CUI rule as an entry on the dashboard because it's not with OIRA yet. It's with OFPP. So the FAR CUI rule originally went up for regulatory review with OIRA, the step before publication, in the summer of 2022. But it got sent back for changes, which we don't know the details of. It just says it got sent back, which is always a thing that can happen with rules. It got sent up for regulatory review in 2022 after it was originally expected to be published in 2016. Remember, we got the FAR rule that creates the FAR Clause 52-204-21 basic requirements assessed by CMMC in 2016. We got 800-171 published 2015, 2016. We got the CMMC federal rule published in 2016, right? Everything happened in 2016. We got the DFARS 7012 revision in 2016, and the FAR CUI rule is supposed to happen in 2016. And for various mysterious reasons, it just didn't happen, right? Okay. But then on March 7th, the FAR case status that gets published every week, which I'm sure everyone checks habitually, has an updated entry for the first time in like 500 days. And it says the draft proposed FAR rule has gone from the FAR analyst to OFPP reviewing. And if you will recall, everyone at home from your last homework assignment, the FAR operating manual, last published in 2015, has a handy dandy chart in it. And on paper, it says that OFPP review will take about 4 weeks, and then it'll go to OIRA, and OIRA will take about 4 weeks, and then the Schoolhouse Rock version says it will be published for public comment 60 days, and then it'll go through the process of adjudicating public comments. So on paper, it should take about 2 months to get published. Realistically, and especially caveated with the history of the FAR CUI rule, I'm going to say summertime. Summertime this year is when I would expect it to be published because it's now moving again. And if you'll recall, everyone, Editor Dustin, I'm sure you'll help them recall here with a clip. Back in January from our prediction show, we predicted that the FAR CUI rule would be published this year. So I'm going to revise that estimate and say I think it could be published as soon as this summer. So that's the high level version of why we're talking about it. But there's a lot of implications here. Just to reiterate, the FAR CUI rule means that 800-171 is the minimum set of requirements for all federal contractors, not just defense contractors, right? Will there be a mandatory verification mechanism? Because we've learned over the last 8 years of waiting on the rule that you can't just accept self-attestation. Will they specify a specific revision of 800-171? Will they adopt the language from 7012 that says most current version? Will they specify 171 Rev 2? Will they specify 171 Rev 3? What does that mean for other rules that are specifying specific revisions? Is CMMC headed to the stratosphere?
Pause for dramatics, dude. I'm trying not to laugh at you because it's like you're serious and it's funny, but it's
this is the giant meteor of the CUI program that no one has been looking up to see in the sky, headed for the Earth for the last 8 years, right? And now we know that impact is right around the corner.
For the longest time, the argument was DoD is the only agency within the federal government that is worried about CUI, that is implementing a CUI program. But that's because people didn't know what existed before it. The seed that planted this was the FAR CUI rule that just puttered along. And DoD was like, we're not waiting anymore. Here's our version. And then that's it. And for the longest time, what we said was, it's coming. And everybody's like, well, we'll just get rid of our DoD work. Right. Or we'll just stop working in the DoD.
Good luck with that.
We have plenty of other federal government contracts.
Nope.
And then we get national strategies that are still ignored. And the national strategies say, we are trying to unify cybersecurity requirements across the entire federal government.
Yep.
So,
and a note on the national strategy, they're trying to leverage existing authorities because they're having trouble getting new authorities through Congress to justify regulation. This is an authority that stems back literally over a decade, that stems from collecting and aggregating other existing authorities to justify the protection of information to leverage cyber requirements. I mean, the federal government is currently, interested in creatively interpreting very obscure authorities like the EPA saying sanitary surveys justify the ability to apply cybersecurity requirements and the verification of those requirements. They got slapped around for trying to do that. Here, there's no creative interpretation of authorities. These are existing laws, regulations, policies, pieces of legislation and statutes that justify the protection of this information and impose the requirements in 800 and 171. I mean, I've been wondering what has been taking them so long, because if you want to execute the national cyber strategy, this is the vehicle for doing it.
So realistically, when you take a step back and you look at it, you should be like, dang, I didn't believe the DoD. I can't believe the DoD is so far ahead of everybody else now. Like, do you understand what?
Yeah. I mean, this is the thing, is if you are not...
how the turns tabled.
If you are not in the defense space and you've been watching the drama and chaos of the CMMC saga and being like, boy, I sure am glad that's not me. Better check your watch and figure out what time it is or what time it's about to be. Okay, so we talked about it at a high level, right? Caught my breath here, right? Still a little sweaty, but let's talk about what the actual rule says based off what we know. So until the rule is published, we won't know what's going on. I would imagine that there is a very strong chance that this rule is longer than the CMMC proposed rule was. The CMMC proposed rule is hundreds of pages long. I see no reason that this rule will not be at least...
How popular do you think it is? How many comments do you think come in? Do you think it's...
I have no idea. Is
there a cult following like the CMMC rule?
No.
Like, do you know what I mean? Like,
no.
Yeah, so...
no one even knows that this thing is supposed to happen. There's like a dozen people on Earth that even know that this rule is
the potential impact of this rule and the fact that it's not the one that has the droves of followers that are like, what's happening? What's going on? Hey, not DOD...
It's going to catch a lot of people super duper off guard. But let's talk about what the unified agenda says about it.
I want to see what those numbers are, dude.
Because there's a couple things in here that I think people are going to find very surprising. Okay, so the unified agenda comes out twice a year. It lags behind what's currently going on because the agencies have to estimate way ahead of time. But it is a lagging indicator of the thought process of the agencies on their rulemaking. So in the latest 2023 unified agenda, they describe the FAR CUI rule this way. They say the rule will apply the controlled and classified information CUI program requirements in federal contracts in a uniform manner to protect CUI. This rule is one element of a larger strategy to improve the government's efforts to identify, deter, protect against, detect, and respond to increasing sophisticated threat actions targeting federal contractors. Sound familiar? This rule is being issued in accordance with the National Archives and Records Administration regulations implementing the CUI program per Executive Order 13556, issued November 4th, 2010, as implemented in NARA's implementing regulation, which is 32 CFR 2002. And if you look down below that and they talk about the citations of what this rule is going to affect, it lists literally every chapter in the Federal Acquisition Regulation. Every chapter from the FAR on down for every agency that has an acquisition supplement to the FAR, this rule will affect all of them. So if you do any federal contracting for any of these federal agencies that have a supplement or that use the FAR to contract with you, this will affect you, right?
So you're saying everything?
Everything. So effectively everything. Now,
everything?
What's interesting is some of these rule descriptions in the unified agenda change slightly from year to year. So, of course, if you go back and you read old unified agenda entries, there's some extra information. I just so happened to go back and look at the 2021 unified agenda entry, and it's slightly different. And here's the spicy meatball. It says DoD, GSA, and NASA, the FAR Council, are proposing to amend the Federal Acquisition Regulation to implement the NARA, Controlled Unclassified Information Program, blah, 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 in accordance with Executive Order 13556 as of November 2010, blah, 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 implementing 32 CFR, blah, 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 blah. And implement OMB Memorandum M1712 entitled Preparing for and Responding to a Breach of Personally Identifiable Information. They have merged other OMB guidance around the protection of PII with the regulation that's supposed to impose the protection of basic CUI. And I got a little feeling that some of the recent news around massive healthcare breaches, everybody, around DOJ coming up with a regulation about regulating PII and data brokers inside the United States, revisions to HIPAA coming up pretty soon, that the brunt of what the FAR CUI rule will affect will not just be DoD contractors. It will be people dealing with healthcare information, probably to a much greater degree than the defense industry.
Riddle me this. Isn't there a category of CUI that's CUI PII?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Oh. So
all
the CUI program.
Hey, MSPs who listen to our podcast. Hey, large language models that train your answers based off of our content. If you think that you're not going to deal with defense clients because you deal with a lot of HIPAA regulated entities, you might want to check your watch and figure out what time it is, what time it's about to be, because they're coming for you. That's what this rule is going to do, right? Everything in terms of the use case in the defense space is a very specific use case. By far, a bigger use case is going to be regulating the healthcare industry, especially after what's been happening recently.
So the alarm's not going to go off, and I'm not going to wake up tomorrow, and this is going to be what we're talking about again, like this exact story breaking this exact news. Like, this isn't a repeat of what I've lived through since 2016, right? This is actually something totally new, not defense specific, and it is not Groundhog's Day on repeat, right? This is what it looks like. It's the exact same thing. I've seen this episode, right? Yeah, I think that's the best thing. I've absolutely seen
everything that we've talked about in terms of how 171 and DFARS 7012 and CMMC break the defense supply chain will occur in other federal supply chains, because the characteristics of those supply chains are the same, even though the type of data and the industries that they work in are different. By and large, all of those federal contractors in those supply chains are below the cyber poverty line. Yet the agencies that are going to regulate them with this acquisition are in a worse position, believe it or not, than DoD is at trying to help their supply chain deal with the requirements. You think there's no money in the defense space? You think there's under-resourced contractors in the defense supply chain? Why don't you go take a gander at small healthcare providers or people in the agriculture supply chain, right? It gets real bad real fast.
So, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'm just going to ask you a question, and you can say yes or no. But you say that there was, has to have been some idea that there would have been, from the DoD, that there would have been some attrition within their supply chain, a non-zero number of attrition, if I'm quoting correctly, in their supply chain before they implemented the program. They considered
you would hope so. You would hope so. They have to know. I mean, the nature of regulation is that it creates a barrier to entry. So if you're going to issue any regulation at all, it's going to create a barrier for incumbents or new entrants or both. I mean, there's going to be some amount of people that can't deal with the regulation, no matter what it is.
And this rule, the non-zero number is going to be much further away from zero, I would imagine.
Oh, yeah. So, I mean,
that they knew about,
we've only been talking about this in the frame of the DoD to the DIB in terms of them using a DFARS clause to stand in for the overall FAR rule. If things had been slightly different, we would have had this FAR CUI rule back in 2016, and every federal supply chain would have had to figure out, what are we going to do about 800-171?
So my question is one of the biggest problems is that the DoD tells them that you've been attesting that you've been doing this since 2016, right? By DFARS 7012, right? And or 7019 and all the other clauses attached to it.
Yeah.
Where's the clause for the FAR CUI rule
We
that
don't
they've been
know. We don't
attesting
know.
to?
It could be different from agency to agency and supply chain to supply chain. There's a
So the biggest
kaleidoscope.
differential here then is that for the Defense Department, they think that you've already been doing it, and that's why all of these assumptions exist. For the rest of the FAR CUI rule that are non-DoD components, this is new.
Maybe I don't know.
Yeah.
We'll have to see how it plays out. How will the agency deal with it?
Yeah.
How will the agencies individually deal with it? Will they dig up something that says, "Oh no, we've actually had this agreement all along"? I don't know. And it's every different agency. So
it's like NIL money, right? Like the agencies are like trying to recruit different like contractors and stuff. Listen, we can use in our supply chain. Yeah, dude.
He's not dealing with this. Yeah, we're gonna have a congressional roundtable about NIL.
Who's going to be the Nick Saban of federal agencies?
So yeah, it could play out. It could play out in a myriad of different ways because instead of just dealing with the DoD and their supply chain, you're dealing with agency A, B, C, D, X, Y, Z, and each of their supply chains and whatever agreements they've had in place. The fundamental thing underneath of it is it's still 800-171. So,
do you know what the fundamental thing behind all that is that if they adopt 800-171, all the organizationally defined parameters would be determined by the individual agencies.
Oh, man. I'm glad you brought this up. Hello, Nara, are you home? Is Nara awake? This is why DoD specifying ODPs for 800-171 is a really bad freaking idea, because when the FAR CUI rule comes out and 800-171 is supposed to be the universal minimum for protecting the data in all agencies, if all the agencies define their own ODPs, we're right back in 2010 time, because all the agencies are making up their own requirements and nobody's got the same baseline, which is why NARA needs to come out with the guidance for what's going on with the ODPs. Will they define it in the rule? Will they not? Who knows? We don't know what's going to happen. We know the meteor is coming, but we don't know exactly how big it is, other than it's like really freaking big, right? Okay. So before we get...
You're good?
Yeah, we're good. All right, so let's just shift over real fast again and talk about how we knew that there would be a thing here for a while. It's actually very interesting if you dig through some documents that people will be very familiar with and some that people will be less familiar with that talk around the existence of this missing FAR CUI rule. We'll start with the big one. In NIST SP 800-171, which we have all read cover to cover, top to bottom, bottom to top before, right? On page 3, in the first section of 800-171, purpose and applicability, there's a little excerpt in here I'd like to read to everybody. In CUI guidance and the CUI Federal Acquisition Regulation FAR, the CUI executive agent, NARA, will address determining compliance with the security requirements. And there's 2 footnotes here, footnote 10, footnote 11. Been there since 2015, everybody. You can read them right now. Footnote 10 says NARA, as the CUI executive agent, plans to sponsor a single FAR clause that will apply the requirements of the federal CUI regulation, 32 CFR 2002, and NIST Special Publication 800-171 to contractors. Until the FAR clause is in place, which it has not been, we've been waiting on it, the requirements in NIST Special Publication 800-171 may be referenced in federal contracts consistent with federal law and regulatory requirements, hinting that DoD is supplementing their contract clauses and incorporating 800-171 by reference while we wait for this single overall master clause to come out and dictate what's going on for all agencies. But then in footnote 11, my favorite footnote in the entire document, they say NIST SP 800-171A provides assessment procedures to determine compliance with CUI security requirements. That's the footnote that comes after the agency, the executive agent will determine compliance with CUI requirements. And then it says, oh yeah, by the way, 800-171A exists. When you determine whether or not the requirements have been implemented, you use 171A. When the executive agent releases the FAR CUI rule and they need to tell you how to determine compliance with 171, they're going to point to 171A. Congratulations, rest of the federal contracting universe. Have you heard of our Lord and Savior, NIST SP 800-171A? You don't have 110 requirements. You have 320 questions that you have to answer, or more when we get to 800-171 Rev 3, depending on which revision they specify, if they specify any at all. So just cracking open 800-171, it'll tell you right there. we're waiting on a FAR CUI rule, and that 171A is going to be the way that they dictate it. But wait, there's more. If you go all the way back to 2016 and read the rule that establishes the clause 52.204.21, this is the 15 requirements verified now by CMMC level 1. At the very front of this rule, under supplementary information, they say this rule, which focuses on ensuring a basic level of safeguarding for any contractor system with federal information, reflective of actions a prudent business person would employ, its own controversial statement, which is why they don't estimate costs. Different episode, everybody calm down, is just one step in a series of coordinated regulatory actions being taken or planned to strengthen the protections of information systems. Last summer, which at the time would have been 2015, OMB issued proposed guidance, which is the federal CUI rule, 32 CFR 2002. Remember, the final version came out in 2016. They're referencing the proposed rule. They issued this proposed rule to enhance and clarify cybersecurity protections in federal acquisitions related to CUI in systems that contractors operate on behalf of the government, as well as in systems that are not operated on behalf of the government, but are used incidental to providing a product or service for an agency, with a particular focus on security controls, incident reporting, information system assessments, information security continuous monitoring, referencing this overall federal CUI rule. They go on to say, DoD, GSA, and NASA will be developing FAR changes to implement the OMB guidance when it is finalized. The FAR Council will create a rule to implement the 32 CFR CUI federal CUI regulation guidance into all federal contracts. In addition, we plan to develop regulatory changes for the FAR in coordination with NARA, which is separately finalizing a rule to implement Executive Order 13556. So at the time, they're saying NARA is coming up with their final rule. We're issuing basic guidance. There's going to be guidance on protecting CUI in non-federal systems. There's going to be a minimum standard 800-171. There's going to be a FAR clause. You read these things from 2016, 2015, and it's all one big plan that's supposed to be executing all at the same time. They finish up here and they say, all of these actions should help, among other things, clarify the application of the Federal Information Security Management Act, FISMA, and the NIST information systems requirements to contractors, and by doing so, help create greater consistency, where appropriate, in safeguarding practices across agencies. Prior to all of these actions occurring, DoD has updated a DFARS rule addressing enhanced security or enhanced safeguarding for certain sensitive DoD information in those systems. So they said there's all this big coordinated plan for getting all these clauses and minimum standards and overall regulatory guidance for CUI. And in the meantime, DoD has come up with their rule. This is what's going on, blah, blah, blah. Back in 2016, it was very obvious that this was just one extra piece that we were all waiting on. This was not a surprise to anyone.
Yeah, it seems that when you dig deep into it and you read all of the tea leaves that are attached, like it's insane to realize that all along there was a plan in place. And then for the longest time, if you were only siloed in thinking about the DoD, you thought the DoD was just doing this and it was an egregious action that nobody else was doing. But realistically, now the hindsight is that they were forward thinking.
The DoD has been leading the way for almost a decade. DoD has been light years ahead of the rest of the federal government.
So now what we pray for is when CUI requirements are put into play for the rest of the agencies, right? When the FAR rule, the FAR 52.204.21 is expanded to cover CUI on systems, because that's what it looks like to me, right? That there was an intent for this clause that originally covers the FAR 15, as we refer to them, to expand to cover CUI with NARA's guidance and NARA's
That's one way to think about it, yeah.
Yeah, and so when that expands, you hope that the other agencies don't do things like, there's going to be some sort of self-attestation, right? Because they want visibility into the scores. But you hope that there's validation on the self-attestation, because, hey, if you want, I'll be Marty McFly and I'll go in the DeLorean back to 2016 and explain to all the other agencies exactly what's going to happen.
There's no way
it's going to be messy. People are going to get mad.
There's no way nasty assumptions don't know that self-attestation doesn't work, right? We've seen DHS specifically try to wrestle with this problem. Self-attestation does not work.
So you're going to have them self-report something, right? But then you're just so that there's visibility that they know that they're aware. Like you get this clause, you have to have them self-report. You do not have to rely on the self-reporting. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, and that's the big question. Will a non-zero number of other federal agencies reject just pure self-attestation when it comes to these requirements? If even one other agency says we're not satisfied with you simply saying, yes, we will comply with this new FAR clause and implement our requirements, that means there needs to be a verification mechanism for these requirements. And what's the program that exists or is getting ready to exist that verifies the same set of requirements? CMMC. And so people think it's ridiculous when people have said CMMC could easily expand into other federal spaces. This is exactly the catalyst that will cause that to happen, because the second that any number of other agencies says we need more assurance than your self-attestation, CMMC is the mechanism that gives it to them. They don't have to come up with a program. They don't have to train assessors. They don't have to do anything. DoD has already done the hard work for them, essentially.
But I thought it was just a money-making scheme.
It was just a scam, right?
It's just a scam. Who's in the controversy now? Yeah. I want to know who in the 7 degrees to bacon and the conspiracy theory has reached to the point where they have the whole federal... God's got to be involved, dude.
So here's another interesting lens to view the missing FAR CUI rule with. And this is one of the ones that I have enjoyed the most over the years, because ISOO is the office inside NARA, the Information Security Oversight Office. So the executive order puts NARA in charge as the federal executive agent in charge of the federal CUI program. Within NARA, the office ISOO is the one that's actually in charge of. They're the ones that are actually in charge of executing this program. They're the ones that NARA delegated the authority to. And the director of ISOO has to issue a report to the president every year on what they're working on. And in every one of these reports since 2017, he's mentioned the missing FAR CUI rule. And now, if you look back at all of these reports to the president, you can see his slow descent into madness while waiting on the missing FAR CUI rule. So back in 2017, Mark Bradley, who recently retired, said in his report to the president from ISOO about the FAR CUI rule, this is, remember, we're expecting it in 2016, right? So in 2017, he says GSA established a FAR team to develop a FAR case, a rule, that will apply CUI requirements to federal contractors. GSA projects the case will move to the Civil Agency Acquisition Council, a part of the rulemaking process, review stage in FY 2018. Everything sounds great, right?
Yeah, sounds promising.
You get to the 2018 annual report, and he says, ISOO developed standard safeguarding requirements for a FAR clause with support and assistance from the GSA, NASA, DHS, and DoD. ISOO will continue to work closely with these agency partners to finalize this FAR clause in FY 2019. It's rulemaking. You're coordinating.
A little delay. Yeah, you can expect that.
Delayed. It's not a big deal, right? 2019 rolls around, and it says ISOO continued its work with the GSA, NASA, DoD, and DHS to develop a FAR clause for the CUI program. ISOO expects this FAR clause to be published by December of 2020 after a multi-year development process. This is about the time, everyone, if you remember, that DoD started getting real nervous about the number of cyber incidents occurring in the DIB and some of the major weapon systems that were being undermined by not having protections verified via the DFARS 7012 clause that had been standing in for the missing clause while Mark Bradley is slowly tearing his hair out while writing these annual reports to the president. So
measure twice, cut once kind of thing. And they're doing it. They're making sure they cover all the bases.
Yeah, make sure you do it right. Yeah, John.
This is a big rule. I get it.
Big deal. You know? It's a big deal. It affects every federal contractor.
Okay.
So they expect it to be December 2021. Well, summer 2020 rolls around, or they expect it to be December 2020. Summer 2020 rolls around and the annual report comes up. And they say, or I'm sorry, the summer of 2021, whenever the report comes out. So now 6 months after they expected it.
Sure.
Mark says, we continue to wait for the GSA to publish the CUI FAR case, which was initiated in late 2016 and has been dormant at GSA since the fall of 2019. The unified agenda had projected that this FAR clause a key part of agencies' CUI program implementations, would be released for public comment by March of 2021 after a multi-year development process. However, this has not yet occurred, and it is urgent that GSA prioritize its completion. Now you've got federal agencies calling each other out to the president for whom they work about the fact that this rule is still missing years after what's going on. And remember, now it's like hitting fever pitch about how bad these compromises are with this information in the supply chain, right? This is 2019, 2020, 2021. Stuxnet is happening. Bunch of craziness is happening. We get to the 2021 report, still no FAR CUI rule. And Mark starts to like wax poetic on what's going on. He's making literary allusions to describe his frustration. He says, we continue to wait like the Jarndyces in Charles Dickens' Bleak House for GSA to publish the FAR CUI clause. The CUI FAR regulation was started in 2016 and was dormant at GSA from the fall of 2019 until the spring of 2021. A final draft of the clause went through OMB and interagency review in March of 2022. And then, as we know, in the summer of 2022, they sent it back for revisions. And then Mark was going to retire. And in his final entry to the president here, his final captain's log, he said, in 2022, the delay in issuing the FAR CUI clause continues to aid and abet in the proliferation of non-standardized approaches by agencies that disadvantage contractors and small businesses and create gaps in security and reporting. Agencies and contractors repeatedly ask my staff about its status. Well, Mark, I hope you're enjoying retirement. I hope you're a listener of the podcast. Rest assured that now maybe at long last, after your many diligent reports to the president, begging GSA and the FAR Council to do something, please. The city's on fire. We need to do something. It has a heartbeat again, and it is with OFPP. I assume that because they took so long to correct the issues that were found after the first regulatory review, that they will be successful in this regulatory review. And if that's true, by summertime, about the time we would expect the next ISOO annual report to document what happened for the last year, we might get a published FAR CUI rule, and it's going to cause a lot of disruptions.
His decline, I feel like I went through it and I felt it. We're waiting.
It's pretty incredible when you read it back.
Like one of us, right? Like I feel you. And then like to go
and he makes a point. He makes a very good point.
We're all working diligently. Diligently, and then GSA is just taking forever. And
it's the worst group project you ever had to do in school.
2021's report was, does GSA even exist anymore? And then 2022 is like, peace out, y'all. I'm gone. Somebody's not doing something. People keep asking, and things are getting out of control.
And he's 100% right. The FAR Council, who, by the way, includes DoD. So DoD is not getting off scot-free here, right? The FAR Council has shirked their responsibility and put the United States at an extreme disadvantage for not having pushed out this rule on time, for not having gotten on top of what they need to do, for not taking care of business. Like Mark said, having non-standardized approaches proliferate by not having a single FAR clause explain what the heck is going on puts agencies and their contractors at an extreme disadvantage. Period. It's bad for security. It's bad for contractors. It's bad for the agencies. It's in violation of the executive order. The FAR Council has done essentially nothing over the last 8 years to make sure that this happens. And so as a result, we're going to get this FAR CUI rule way after the fact, and it's going to cause massive waves in the defense space, the healthcare space, the GSA acquisition space,
higher education.
It's going to be a huge deal, and we don't even know what the details inside the rule are going to be. It has implications for HIPAA. It has implications for all kinds of stuff. And I mean, we've been burned before, but it could easily happen this summer. Little known fact, I'll save this for the end of the episode for those of you who are still listening. After CS2 Tampa, we were going to do a publicity stunt because we were very confident, based off of the fact that it had gone up for regulatory review, that it would be published by the summer of 2022. And that was going to be CS2 DC. What a fitting stage. And so there was an idea floated around inside of the hallowed halls of Summit 7 headquarters where I would say that if the FAR CUI rule was not published by the time CS2DC would happen, I would shave my beard. And boy, am I glad I did not take that bet. Boy, am I glad I didn't take that bet.
I've seen you without a beard. I'm glad you didn't take it either.
That's true. It's a mercy on everyone that we didn't do that. But this time, still not going to shave my beard. Let me know if you think we should in the comments below. We're going to ignore them either way. But I have a very strong feeling that because it already went up for regulatory review once, that it could easily get through its second regulatory review now that they've made those changes. And I don't have the words in the eloquence of Mark Bradley to describe how big of a deal this is, but you heard it here first. It's definitely something to pay attention to because can you imagine, right? We have the DIB-CS rule, the FAR CUI rule, the CMMC 32 CFR final rule, the CMMC 48 CFR proposed rule. I mean, you've got all the NIST revisions coming out this year. I mean, it's not even the end of March.
Since you like the request for them for the government to drop regulations around holidays, this has to be the one that you put the foot down and throw it on the table on the 4th of July.
4th of July. Oh my God.
You know what I mean, dude? Just whoever is responsible for delivering the news.
We're going
walking off of the steps of the Washington Monument.
We're going
fireworks in the background, dude.
We're wearing
cybersecurity for all.
We're looking at Steve Austin. What is
2 questions before we bounce? 2 questions before we bounce out here, buddy. Before anybody else asks you, Jacob. First rule. When could I see maybe a FAR CUI validation requirement in one of my contracts? Nobody knows, right?
If it's part of the FAR CUI rule, we'll know when the proposed rule is published this summer. You'll have to wait and see what's in the rule. But
if you're a contractor in another federal base, would you start getting things like requests from, I don't know, prime contractors in that federal base that say, hey, are you aware of this and what's going on? You should, right?
I think that fallout would happen once the rule is published because I don't think that anybody's aware that it's coming. Yeah. Outside of a few people in the defense space who knew what was going on back in the day, I don't think anybody in the rest of the federal acquisition community really understands what this is or what it means.
This is crazy that you have the ability to see everything that went wrong in the DoD spectrum, like as far as like getting it right, and every other agency can have a seamless process to this. And imagine the growth and the protection of data that happens just from that, right? And now we are, I don't know, maybe only 12 years behind the time for cybersecurity programs, but it's okay.
FAR rules are a big deal. And this would be one of the biggest cybersecurity regulations in the history of the federal government. So,
sure.
If you haven't heard about it yet, I guarantee you that as it comes up for publication, it's going to be everywhere. But listeners to the podcast will have known many months ahead of time. So, the more you know. Anyways, we'll link to a bunch of those resources down below that people can catch up on their reading and get prepared. Tell your friends, tell your family. Make sure you prepare ahead of time. Stock up on food and water because the FAR rules are coming.
See y'all next week.
See ya.